The real Battle of Anderson took place 3 weeks after the Confederacy had officially lost the Civil War. But that doesn't prevent its enthusiastic reenactment every April in a South Carolina field. 150 years after the start of what many white Southerners hate being called the Lost Cause, hey! The subject of the Civil War is still loaded, but not nearly as explosive as it once was.
I am a full-blooded, Southern-born, raised Confederate soldier. My aim to this is to carry on the history of what has happened in the past.
Reenactor Terry Franks, known as Squirrel, may be a die-hard Confederate, but most of the reenactors switch off, portraying Confederates one day, Union soldiers the next.
We're living history, and when the event is over on the field, the blues and the grays, we all mix together and we all have fun together. Yeah. It's camaraderie.
Kenneth Bachand has been taking part in Civil War reenactments off and on for more than 50 years.
We're just trying to show people what it was like on a battlefield in those days.
But when it's the Civil War, 8th grade history teacher Joe Evans thinks assumptions are often made.
It seems like Civil War, war between the state reenactors get this stigma that other reenactors don't. I've never heard anybody who is a Revolutionary War reenactor accused of wanting to restart that war. But it's just this stigma that we have, and it's got to be the slavery issue.
11 slave states seceded from the Union. South Carolina was the first. Among their reasons, states' rights, in particular, the right to own slaves. But some perspective here. Americans remained divided over whether slavery was even the main cause of the Civil War. According to a new poll conducted by the Pew Research Center, roughly 4 out of 10 say slavery. Nearly 5 out of 10 say states' rights.
You know, I come out here and there's a certain spirituality that pervades this place.
Slaves are buried here, their graves unmarked. This quiet spot is a proud addition to the tour of historic Drayton Hall near Charleston, South Carolina. Bernard Powers is a professor of African American history at the College of Charleston and an advisor to Drayton Hall. Do you think the Civil War will ever end in this country?
I believe that what William Faulkner said is very true, particularly about the South, and that is the past is not dead, it's not even over.
But Powers admits
2011 is quite different than 1961.
1961, the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War.
Segregation was the order of the day in the South by law, and racial exclusion existed by practice in many places in the North also. And so the period of the early to mid-1960s in which the centennial was being celebrated was a time period in which this nation was in the throes of a civil rights and racial revolution.
Powers remembers arriving in Charleston as a graduate student in 1975.
I can recall taking the boat ride out to Fort Sumter, and the park ranger gave us the narrative of the events that led up to the war. There was no mention of the institution of slavery whatsoever.
On April 12, 1861, 4 months after South Carolina had seceded from the Union, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Charlestonians watched from rooftops as if it were a show, not the beginning of the horrific 4-year war that killed more than 600,000 soldiers, leaving the South destitute and in ruins. Compared to the 100th anniversary, fire! 150 years after that day, in Charleston, you could hear a lot more of the Civil War story, told from multiple points of view.
These shackles were used for a child.
Nicole Green is director of the Old Slave Mart Museum.
Visitors are really changing. They want the real story, and they want that story from different perspectives. Visitors who are coming to hear that sort of Gone with the Wind, hoop skirts and mint juleps story, they're few and far between.
But you discover in Charleston how many people see the Civil War as their own history, triumphant and tragic.
This flag with the holes in it is the first Confederate flag that flew at Fort Sumter. I'm proud of the people that put it there. I'm glad that it survived so we can show people like you the real things.
June Wells is director of the Confederate Museum and a past national president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
When the men enlisted for the war between the states, this is the room where they enlisted. After the war and after Reconstruction, this room meant a lot to them. They brought their own things and started the museum.
What they stood for may not be politically correct in 2011, but what they left here is priceless historically.
This is our lithograph of the Ordinance of Secession. There were 171 men who signed it, and they only made one for each man, no more. One of my ancestors signed it, Merrick Ezra Carn.
If you look to the right, you'll see another name, Williams Middleton.
What was his thinking? Was it slavery? Was it money?
The combination of so many factors. Slavery was certainly a dominant, if not the dominant factor.
Charles Duell is a descendant of Williams Middleton's.
But also, I think there was a feeling among people like Williams Middleton that they were kind of doing what their grandparents had done in revolting against the British Crown.
After the American Revolution, there would have been no United States if the framers of the Constitution hadn't kicked the can down the road. They left the slavery issue to future generations to resolve. Williams Middleton's great-grandfather was president of the First Continental Congress. His grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. They were founding fathers of the Union Williams Middleton risked his family's fortune to break apart. Union soldiers burned the Grand Plantation House at the end of the Civil War. Only one wing was left standing. Today, Charles Duell is president of the foundation formed to preserve and maintain Middleton Place and its spectacular gardens, a National Historic Landmark.
In my childhood, I would ask about the Civil War, and the subject was avoided. My grandparents, and I think many people of their generation, were a little too close to it to want to really put it out on the table.
Duell did want to put it out on the table. Attitudes have evolved.
The research had come up with 2,800 names of slaves that had belonged to the Middleton family.
Middleton Place was one of the first Charleston area plantations to showcase the slave side of its history.
Clearly, slavery was horrific, a terrible institution, but it was what it was. And I think for us as human beings today, to have a sense of history and a sense of place, we need to know the facts.
And this is where the worst of the fighting, this is where by the next day, you couldn't take a step without stepping on someone.
In Franklin, Tennessee, where one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War took place, 10,000 soldiers, most of them Confederate, were killed, wounded, or just disappeared in 5 hours of fighting. Just look at what's there now. Robert Hicks is the author of The Widow of the South, about the Battle of Franklin. He helped found Franklin's Charge, dedicated to preserving the battlefield. He calls this place hallowed ground.
How is it that what you describe as hallowed ground has become a Domino's Pizza?
I think that Franklin wanted to forget, remember 750 men and women, children, black and white, crawl out of their cellars and they're faced with 10,000 casualties. I think they wanted to move on.
Nearly 1,500 Confederate soldiers killed in the Battle of Franklin are buried here, next to what was a golf course. The golf course, the cemetery, all of this was part of the battlefield.
We were able to raise over $5 million to buy this, it'll be completely reclaimed. No golf tees, no tennis courts. You'll see the battlefield where many of these boys died. Something important happened here. This place and in all the battlefields.
Hicks has the answer for anybody who asks. After 150 years, why not just let the Civil War be forgotten?
It's something to be honored and to be commemorated and to be remembered, because that's how we got to here. And I think that is such a key piece of the puzzle of what it is to be an American.